Hiya, welcome to video number 4. This is on scene 4 of Streetcar, and again what I'm just going to do is go through a little bit about what happens in the scene, talk about where the sources of conflict are, and talk a little bit about the patterns that you might want to look for. So scene 4 is early the following morning. So again, think about how Williams is tracking the time through the play. Scene 4 is the morning after the poker night, the morning after everything's happened, and there's a very different mood in this scene. I think it might be worth talking at this point, by video 4, at the play as a whole and how conflict is working in the play as a whole. One way to look at it is that Williams presents conflict in quite a subtle way. He's got characters here who are very different and who often hate each other, and who are often violent towards each other, both through their language and through their actions. But in this play, it's not all at 100 miles an hour, is it? It's not all shouting and screaming all of the time. That wouldn't work as a play, would it? As a drama. You have to have moments of quiet and reflection, and you have to build up to moments of violence. It almost has to be earned. And I think what we've got in this play, if you think about what's happened in the first couple of scenes, we had scene 1 which established some conflicts bubbling under. It established Blanche's resentment towards Stella. It established how Blanche was different from the other two. Then you had scene 2 where it kind of bubbled up at Stanley kind of being annoyed with Blanche for trying to swindle him, and Stanley and Blanche again having very different worldviews about a lot of things. And then scene 3, you almost got this climax where Stanley's resentment and his anger came out in kind of hitting Stella. And now Williams has kind of gone back to the conflict bubbling under the surface again. He's not escalating further. Try and think about conflict in this play as a series of kind of peaks and troughs. Scene 3 is a peak moment of conflict in the play. And so now we're back down to kind of almost a bit of calm again. And that's established straight away in scene 4. Stella's lying down in the bedroom. Her face is serene in the early morning sunlight. It's a massive contrast to what we've just seen before, with all the screaming and shouting and violence and the ear-splitting noise of Stanley shouting Stella. And the whole scene is a conversation between Stella and Blanche about what should happen next. Blanche is absolutely outraged by what's just happened. Stella is serene and doesn't seem to be too bothered about it. And then at the end of this scene, you get a really key moment where Blanche goes on another rant. Blanche likes rants, doesn't she? There's quite a few monologues from Blanche already in this play. She goes on this rant about Stanley being an animal and an ape, and Stanley overhears it in secret. And we see then another really clever moment there. We see kind of Stanley starting to plan Blanche's downfall. We get a really big reason why Stanley kind of hates Blanche, and we can see that it's about to escalate a little bit further now throughout the play. So in terms of the discussion between Stella and Blanche, it's very deliberately kind of not this massive argument. But again, what Williams is doing, which he was doing in the previous scenes, is he just establishes through the dialogue low-level conflict between two people who have very different worldviews and very different opinions. So basically the conflict here in scene 4 all the way through is Blanche thinks that Stella should leave Stanley, and Stella thinks she loves Stanley and she wants to stay. That's the central conflict, isn't it, between the two characters in this scene. It's as simple as that. And all the way through this scene, you get this long kind of argument. In terms of the ways in which Williams is doing that, probably the best thing is to look at the rant at the end of the scene. But just before we do that, I think it's worth just looking at again at the language that both of them are using. One of them is kind of using the language of kind of violence and outrage, Blanche, and then Stella is using the language of kind of calmness. So again, you've got Blanche saying things Pull yourself together and face the facts, page 42. You're married to a madman. Your fix is worse than mine is. You've given in. So immediately Blanche is using more dramatic language to describe Stanley in the relationship. Look at the words. She uses that epithet madman, doesn't she? You're married to a madman. An epithet is just a word, it's like a name that you call somebody. She describes the relationship as a fix. Your fix is worse than mine is, on page 42. Interestingly, Blanche is now using more prosaic language to describe relationships. She's not describing this relationship in the romantic terms that she ideally would like, is she? She's describing this relationship as a fix. On the other hand, Stella is very calm, isn't she? I'm not in anything I want to get out of. I'm not in anything that I have a desire to get out of. People have got to tolerate each other's habits, I guess. So if you look at Stella's language, it's all about kind of tolerating, being content, being fairly happy. One of the things that happens is the stage directions are quite sparing, but again the stage directions do that in the using adverbs. So you've got on page 42, Stella says slowly and emphatically, I'm not in anything I want to get out of. Stella's speaking slowly and emphatically. On the other hand, Blanche is saying incredulously, what, Stella? So incredulously is to do with incredible, isn't it? Like Blanche finds it incredible, she can't believe it. So Stella is speaking slowly and emphatically. Blanche is speaking incredulously. If you look again at verbs on page 43, shakily she twists a cigarette into a holder. That's Blanche. So shakily. Whereas on the other hand, Stella shakes her head. So again, Stella's gestures are much more sure of herself, whereas Blanche's gestures kind of reveals kind of anxiety. Page 44, Stella laughs a little, and then on the other hand, Blanche suddenly springs up and crosses to the phone. She speaks shrilly. So again, you've got Blanche being this kind of embodiment of anxiety, Stella being this embodiment of kind of calmness. And that's the conflict in this scene between the two of them. Blanche is anxious and she wants Stella to leave. Stella is calm and she wants to stay. Just very quickly, if we talk about the most interesting part of this scene, which is the speech that Blanche makes. I said in the previous video, look out for the metaphors that they start using for Stanley being an animal. It starts on page 45. What such a man has to offer is animal force, and he gave a wonderful exhibition of that. So she starts talking about him in terms of being an animal. Interestingly, earlier on page 41, even Stella does it, but for an opposite reason. So Stella says he didn't know what he was doing. He was as good as a lamb when I came back, and he's really very, very ashamed of himself. So even when Stella's defending him, she's still using that animal language, but Stanley was as good as a lamb, whereas again the contrast is animal force for Blanche. If you have a look at on page 47, then Blanche really goes for this metaphor of Stanley being an animal and an ape. There's a massive kind of semantic field in all of Blanche's language here about Stanley being either an ape or a caveman. So he acts like an animal, has an animal's habits, eats like one, moves like one, talks like one. One of the ways to look at Blanche's speech in terms of where the conflict might be coming from here is, this is Blanche's one chance to persuade Stella to leave, isn't it? There's a lot of rhetoric in this speech, that kind of language that people use in adverts and in politics to try and persuade. Lots of rules of three. Eats like one, moves like one, talks like one. There's lots of kind of emotive language, isn't there? Lots of verbs and lots of language. There's this big semantic field towards Stanley being an animal or a caveman. Maybe he'll strike you, or maybe grunt and kiss you. They're in the front of a cave, all grunting like him and swilling and gnawing and hulking. So Blanche really goes for this persuasive language. She calls his poker night, you call it, this party of apes. Somebody growls, some creature snatches at something. So Blanche uses all of this language of animals, creatures, snatching, growling, swilling, gnawing, hulking, ape-like, acts like an animal, has an animal's habits. She really goes for this kind of rhetoric of Stanley being an animal. And then what she does is she uses contrast. So you've got lots of verbs there, gnawing, swilling, hulking. And then towards the end of Blanche's scene on page 47, she starts trying to contrast that with the things that she thinks Stella should want. So maybe we're a long way from being made in God's image, but Stella, my sister, there has been some progress since then. Such things as art, as poetry and music. Some kinds of new light have come into the world. Some tenderer feelings have had some little beginning. There's a big contrast in the language there, which kind of underpins the conflict between what Blanche sees herself as and what Stella and Stanley see themselves as. So you've got loads of abstract nouns: poetry, music, art, feelings. There's lots of abstract nouns which she's kind of trying to appeal to Stella's sense of beauty, isn't she? And she's saying, you're in this ugly situation with this animal, and you know the human race has evolved to these bigger things like art and poetry. Come and join us on this side. She's presenting kind of her side against Stanley, isn't she, in that scene? And as we said, Stanley overhears every word of that, and so that's quite an ominous moment. And again, if you think about conflict, on that last page of the scene, page 48, he laughs and clasps her head to him. Over her head, he grins through the curtains at Blanche. And again, look at those verbs that Williams is using for Stanley. He laughs and clasps her head, and then he grins through the curtains at Blanche. It's like he's won, isn't it? And he has. She's gone to him after having heard Blanche's speech, creating this conflict between the two of them. Stella makes her choice and goes to hug Stanley, and Stanley knows it and grins. So that's quite an important moment, the end of scene 4. Maybe that grin, we can see that as Stanley's decision to kind of ruin Blanche. So that's scene 4. Again, I'll finish off by showing some post-its. So I think the biggest thing to look at in this scene is Williams' use of contrast. You might call it antithesis if you're being fancy, but that idea of we haven't got overt conflict in this scene because we've just had a scene of huge conflict. Williams is kind of providing light and shade. So what you've got is kind of subtly in the language, the conflict of contrasting things. The calmness of Stella versus the anxiety of Blanche. The apes of the poker night versus art and poetry and music that Blanche loves. Those sorts of things. So with that, you've got lots of symbolism and metaphor again. So you've got the metaphor of Stanley being an animal, running through all of this play, being a big thing in this scene, especially in being an ape and a caveman. That's a really big metaphor. Lots of adjectives and adverbs in the stage directions in this scene that are worth looking at. And again, all of those provide that contrast. So there's lots of adverbs, for example, like we said, or like I said, Blanche speaks, where is it now? Blanche speaks incredulously, whereas Stella speaks slowly and emphatically. A couple of other concepts new things that I've written. Use of epithets. I mentioned epithets, didn't I? It's worth looking at epithets actually in all of the scenes. What do these people call each other is really important for how conflict kind of is created. Blanche uses madman, ape, brute in this scene, doesn't she? Blanche's epithets for Stanley are all kind of quite aggressively negative. Animal, ape, madman, brute. And again, I suppose you could spend quite a lot of time looking at these because she uses different ones for Stella. On page 40, baby, my baby sister. The fact that she calls Stella baby and baby sister, that's very different from what she calls Stanley, isn't it? Madman and brute. And again, that provides that contrast and that conflict between the two ways of looking at it. And just lastly, it's worth introducing this concept here, which is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is something that playwrights use all the time, and it's where the audience knows something that characters on the stage don't. And I think this is really the first time we're seeing it, this use of dramatic irony, and it's at the end, because Stella and Blanche don't know that Stanley overheard that conversation, do they? But we know. So that's an example of Williams using dramatic irony to create that kind of conflict and tension that's going to come later. We know now that Stanley has overheard Blanche's insults. Blanche doesn't know that, and Stella doesn't know that. So Stanley has got this kind of almost a secret, hasn't he, that we share with him as the audience. And that's going to be the source of some of the conflict that comes later, because Stanley is not going to forgive Blanche easily for calling him an ape and trying to split up his marriage. So that's the end of the scene 4 one. Thanks.